Welcome to Sunflower Movement. I am your host, Ashley Buckner. Before we get started, here's a quick disclaimer. This podcast is for education and entertainment purposes only. I am a licensed therapist, but unless you have a signed consent form with me, I am not your therapist. This platform is not a form of psychotherapy, counseling, or healthcare of any kind. Sunflowers bloom in the most unexpected places, and they adjust to remain connected to the sun. Metaphorically, I define these sunflower movements as experiences with people, places, and moments where we feel seen, heard, and believed. Thank you for tuning in. Hello, everyone. Welcome. I'm so excited for today's episode. I'm here with my friend, Emily. She's like my new best friend. We've been through a lot together today. And I just have to tell you before we even jump in, Emily's character and grace and just the capacity to hold space for my own humanity has meant a lot. And so Emily Waite, welcome.
Hi. It has been quite the day.
It has been quite the day. We've navigated a lot together. It's really special to have you here because you are actually my first guest that I haven't asked to come on. You submitted a submission to come on the podcast. I loved your story and just kind of the essence of who you are. And I'm excited to have you here and just to have this really open, meaningful conversation. So Emily is from Utah. She actually went to Southern Utah University, which is in Cedar City where I live. So I'm going to let Emily introduce herself.
Yeah. So like Ashley said, my name's Emily. This has been such a fun day. I'm really excited for the conversation that we're going to have. But I'm originally from Payson, Utah. So right in the middle of Utah County. And I came down to Southern Utah University in fall of 2021. So I was here for 3 years and I just graduated in April. So I consider Cedar City my home, honestly. Like coming back now to be able to do this recording and just kind of coming back here just reminds me of all the growth and stuff that's happened. But yeah, I got my degree in Anthropology and Criminal Justice. So a little bit different than anything I do outside of that. Yeah, I was raised in the Mormon church, all the things, right in the middle of the Mormon bubble. So I'm excited to talk today a little bit about deconstruction and see what we can do to help build this community in that way.
Yeah, no, I love all of that. And congratulations on your recent graduation.
Thank you.
That is a big deal. I have such fond memories of college. College was honestly a pivotal time in my life and just shifted the trajectory. I don't even think we'd be sitting down right now having this conversation had I not gone to college and just had the experiences that I had. So it feels special to be talking with someone who's kind of in that place in their life.
Yeah.
And just, yeah, so it's really kind of surreal in that way. I definitely want to get more into your upbringing. But I was curious, I wanted to ask, like, kind of what drew you to want to come on Sunflower Movement? Like, why did you do a submission? Like, what is it about this, like, community that I'm really trying to intentionally build that, like, brought you here? I would love to hear some of that.
Yeah, so when I was living here in Cedar City, that was kind of when I was in my process of deconstruction. And after I graduated and moved back up north, I was doing a lot of searching of, like, just post-Mormon spaces and just healing from religious trauma, and I found yours and it was like Cedar City, and I was like, that's my people. Like they know all the places. I remember in one of your first episodes you were talking to a friend who started Bristlecone, and I was like, I went there every Saturday. Like I love just this space. And so it was really amazing to find somebody who connected to not just the community but also my experience post-religion. And so seeing that, it was just really cool to find people that know about that, because you can find a lot of post-religious spaces and people with similar experiences, but I feel like Cedar City is pretty niche. Cedar City is its own experience in and of itself. And so when I moved and I found you, I was like, oh my gosh, like this is exactly what I needed. This is the community that understands this, like, physical space as well as the emotional space that people are in.
I'm really glad you brought that up and we're speaking on it. And I think about this all the time, right? So if you live up north in Salt Lake, we can find a bunch of post-Mormon spaces because there are more. I mean, could there be more? 1,000%.
Absolutely.
But Cedar City is really unique in that, and it's such a small town. And it's really taboo to talk about like post-Mormon stuff here in Cedar because it's so small. It's actually it's so funny you brought up Bristlecone, and I talked about this I think in one of my episodes, but like Bristlecone is essentially how I was okay living back here. So I grew up here. Obviously I left for a long time, but then Bristlecone, which is a coffee yoga space here in Cedar for the listeners, it is the best parts of, I don't even feel like I'm in Utah when I'm at Bristlecone.
Absolutely. It feels like otherworldly, like out of here. It's such an intentionally created space.
It is so intentionally created. Everybody belongs there. Everybody's welcome. Diversity is so vast. It's really powerful, and I love it. And it's also been really healing and so important for me. I actually think that we're talking about all the things of like, this podcast exists because of Bristlecone. And I think that's also what intentionally for me, I like reflected on Bristlecone a lot as I was thinking about building this community of talking more openly about Mormon religious trauma on my social media. And then what led to then now Sunflower Movement is just, we need spaces where we can come and have authentic conversations that recognize the trauma, but also talk about like what's after, and which I'm so excited about our conversation today, Emily, because you have deconstructed a lot just in what you shared. Before we jump into that, will you tell us a little bit about your like Mormon upbringing? How, like, were you born and raised? Like, kind of tell us about your story a little bit before we get to the, like, before you deconstruct.
Yes, absolutely. The precursor, I would say. So
yes, because you mentioned that you were really Mormon. So let's hear how Mormon you were.
Yes.
I'm joking.
I was the molliest of Mormons, I would probably say, like all in. So I, again, was born and raised Utah County. My family is all religious, both sides, very Mormon, very active. You were always in callings. We were always going to church. You participated in everything. Was super involved in seminary and all of these spaces. I'm the oldest of 4, so I have 2 sisters and a brother.
Okay.
And so kind of we've just been all in it the whole time we were growing up. And then moving to college, I remember specifically talking to my parents because, you know, moving to college is a really big deal, and it's kind of like, oh, like this, you need to make sure you uphold your values and need to make sure you're doing good. And I remember it, like, specifically telling them, like, religion will be a priority for me. Like, church is going to be a priority. When I moved to college, I was always enrolled in Institute. I made sure that I was going to all my ward activities. And so I was all in. Like, there was never a thought in my mind that I would ever leave. And it just never occurred to me that that was something that would work in my life. I subscribed to all of the Mormon things. I was waiting for a missionary at the point of first moving to college. I was taking temple prep classes. I was considering my own mission, like all of these things. I had just figured that that was going to be my life. And then I ended up coming to school and again was just really involved in all of it. It was like, this is what is supposed to be for me. Like, this just resonates with me so much. And between my freshman year and my sophomore year of college, I had the opportunity to study abroad for a few weeks. And
where did you go?
I went to London for a few weeks with the Theater and Arts Administration at SUU. So I got to spend 2 weeks eating gelato and going to West End shows, which was my dream come true. But through that, I went to every church there that was not an LDS church. We went to a Catholic church, and now I can't remember what the other one was. It'll come to me at some point. But we went to all the cathedrals and everything, and I just remember being like, wow, this is so, like, finding the parallels in, like, communion and the sacrament and thinking about all of those. And then that same summer, I went to my first Pride in Salt Lake City. I went with the SU Pride Alliance, and that experience really shifted me, because I went on a Sunday where I would normally have woken up and gotten ready and gone to church, and I instead went up to Salt Lake and walked in this parade. And I remember being really scared and being like, oh my God, like, what if something happens? Like, I'm up in Salt Lake all by myself with this group of people that I'm just barely getting to know. And walking in that parade, I just remember the love that was pouring out of every single individual there. And it was like, oh my God, I have felt more love in this hour and a half that I've been walking down downtown Salt Lake than I ever have walking into a congregation at church. And that really shifted me into a nuanced phase where it was like, okay, I still believe in this doctrine and this Mormon ideology, but I also really love the LGBTQ plus community. And I also really love just genuine kindness and genuine openness. And everybody was always like, oh, it's like being the cool Mormon, right? You're open to all these things that the church is usually against. And I kind of stayed in that for a while. And actually just a little over a year ago. It was October of 2023. It all kind of came to a head. So I was approached with some ideas about consent and ethics in a class at the university, and was like, wait a minute. I am a part of an organization that does not practice these in any way.
Yeah, and I'm curious, could you expand on, there are some things in your story I want to get back to, but I want you to expand on this consent piece. Like, how did you know?
Yeah.
And in learning about it, how did you know that you're a part of an organization that doesn't prescribe to consent?
Oh, that is such a wonderful question. So we had been talking about consent in research studies. So we were learning about the early studies in anthropology, which if you dive down that history lane, it is really problematic. But something I love about my field is that they have taken ownership of that and been like, yeah, we did some messed up stuff at the beginning and we're now trying to repair that. And they were doing specific studies with women who were diagnosed with HIV, and they didn't tell them. And then they would give birth and the babies would be HIV positive. And when a baby is born HIV positive and not treated, they pass away very quickly.
Yeah.
And these children were dying, and the women weren't being told that their babies had HIV. They weren't being told that they had HIV. And I was the first time I ever cried in a class because I was just heartbroken. And it was like, they're not being told what they're getting into in this space. And at the time I had a close friend who was preparing to go through the temple, and I was thinking about her experience and her going to temple prep. I had finished a temple prep class and I was like, I don't actually know what she's getting into. Like, she doesn't know what she's getting into. My sister at that point was also, I guess it was a little bit later, but she was going to be getting married. And so she was getting ready to be endowed. Or I think she was already married at that point, something around there. I don't remember all the dates. But it was like, she didn't know what she was going to do because it is what they like sacred, right?
Yeah, no one talks about it. I mean,
yeah.
I only know what goes on in the temple because I've watched it on YouTube.
Same. Yeah.
Right? Like, no one talks about it. So how do you actually prep for something?
Yes.
And if you knew, if people were informed, would they do it? And that's
Yes.
what comes up for me.
Yes.
Sounds like that's what's coming up for you.
Exactly. And it was like, how can you choose to really, because it is so dependent on your eternal salvation. Like, this is what you do to get to heaven. It's like, I feel like if you're going to make a choice with that much significance in an afterlife, you should probably know what it is.
Yeah, that's
like,
such a valid
you
point.
should know what you're getting into, or even like, just, I don't know, I wish they had like a trailer or something that you could watch of like, here's even just a little bit of what you might be getting into. And it was in that experience where I started being like, oh, the temple doesn't really have that. So then I got a little bit curious, and for better or for worse, in one night around 10 p.m. I was like, okay, I'm just gonna look up a couple things. Like, I'm just a little curious about this. And I dove headfirst down the cliff of deconstruction. Like, it happened in one night where I had watched the video on YouTube. I read most of the CES letter. I was finding Mormon Stories episodes, and it just all was like, what is happening?
Yeah, no, that's a lot to be crashing down. And I think what's coming up for me in this story is, prior to this, you had this really beautiful experience with the LGBTQ plus community,
Yes.
right? Where you have this felt sense of what I would call belonging.
Absolutely.
For just being who you are, right? Where I think the church and high control religion in general wants to say, oh, like, no, everyone belongs here. But really, it's more like fitting in.
Yes.
And these are all the things that you have to do if you want to belong here, which to me, that is not belonging. That's fitting in.
Absolutely.
And those are two very different felt experiences. And so you'd grown up in this church where you were just fitting in or always trying to fit in, like being that perfect Molly Mormon. And then you go to this like pride parade and you're just you just show up there to be a support to the community, and you just feel this love and this sense of belonging and this experience, right? Which opened the door, in my opinion, to your deconstruction.
Yeah, I would say so, because I think it allowed me to really be like, okay, there are spaces outside of this religious organization where I can feel loved and feel like I belong. And it's okay that that's in other spaces. It's not just one and only, this is the only option. If you belong here, you don't have to belong anywhere else. If you belong anywhere else, then you don't belong here. Does that make sense? So
yeah,
I think
what's coming up for me, it's so gray, right?
Yes.
It's not black or white.
No, not at all. There's so much area where you can shift in that. So there's space for all of it, and I feel like the church doesn't allow that space.
No. No, there's not very much.
No.
There's not very, the church doesn't, in my opinion, there are a lot of nuanced members.
Yes.
But
yeah.
I don't think the church as a collective holds space for the nuance.
I don't think it does at all. I think it's really beautiful that people have the nuance. I hold a lot of grace for my nuanced phase and who I was in that moment, because being nuanced is exhausting.
I can only imagine. I can only imagine.
Yeah, I would say if anything, it prepares you for the exhaustion of deconstruction because you're sitting there jumping through the mental hoops. And I remember sharing with a close friend of mine kind of right before that period of everything kind of falling apart. And I was just like, I just need a break. Like, I just don't have the mental energy to be religious in any way. I don't have the time or the space or anything to be able to say, well, I am a member of the church, but I also support this and I also believe in this. And it's just really hard to jump through all of those, especially because growing up how I did, it was very black and white. It's like, we are all in. You have to be all in, right? To qualify for quote unquote exaltation. And so learning how to navigate the nuance was hard, but I think it's a really good stepping stone for people. And I think it's a really healthy way to practice any religion at all.
Yeah. Well, and then it sounds to me that you get to really tune into, is this a religion aligning with my being?
Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
Should I always feel like I have to say, well, yes, I'm a member of the church and I also support the LGBTQ plus community, right? Like, you almost feel like you have to continue to explain yourself.
Yeah.
Instead of it just being like, this is what I believe. And it brings me joy and peace and spirituality. And it's hard to get that in a high control setting because there's so many things you're supposed to be doing.
Yeah.
So you go down this rabbit hole at like 10 o'clock at night, like you said, and you did all the things. And then what happened?
And then I think I just broke as a person. I felt as though everything that I had ever learned about myself was wrong. Like, anything that I had ever learned about who I was and what my purpose was and where I came from, where I'm going, literally every fiber of my being felt like it was broken. And I feel like I lost myself a little bit because it was just so much of who I was. Like, my pinnacle years of growing up, it was being in Young Women's and being in primary and being involved with my family and all of these things. It was just, the voice in my head was that of somebody who was Mormon. And so learning that all came from something that was no longer true really shattered me.
And how old were you? So this was last year, correct?
Yeah, this was last year. So I was 20 years old. So it was, So like 20 years of my life, which to many people is still pretty young. Like, but it's still a long time to have dedicated so much time and energy into that.
And I would say too, like at 20 years old, I think like 18 to 25, there's so much that happens. And it's kind of, you're figuring all of these things out. And I think of that happening at 20 years old could be very earth shattering. You're already like in this weird phase of figuring out your identity by moving out of your parents' house and going to college. And then the thing you've built your entire identity on is now gone. Yeah,
exactly. And so it really feels, there's, the best word to describe it is kind of like empty. You just kind of feel like everything about you is it's just gone down this hole with everything else that you've learned. And so I was thankfully surrounded by really supportive people. I know that that's not the case in most deconstruction spaces, especially when your family can still be really religious, but thankfully I have a really close friend system. My boyfriend is great and some close family members that have been incredibly supportive in that. So although I felt broken and empty, it was like they were kind of just lifting me up a little bit.
Yeah. And how are family relations now?
They are good. So I'm the first of my immediate family to actually leave. My extended family were pretty, I would say evenly, I have a very large family, so somewhat evenly divided on who is still incredibly active and those who have either completely removed their records or are inactive. So it isn't like this huge deal that I'm one to leave. And I think it was I don't think it came as a surprise. I think it was more of they just were waiting for me to actually say it out loud, because especially when I was nuanced, I was bringing home coffee, and I would drop a swear every now and then, or even just like my opinions on things. I'm a very opinionated person, and so I think they were just waiting for that. But my family's not confrontational at all. They very much have taken to heart the like value of peacemaking and not being confrontational, and so I think that has its own hardships, but in that way I think it's also made me a safe space, that if it was ever to happen to anybody else in my close family, they would know that I'm somebody that they could come talk to.
Yeah, and you mentioned your sister is married and she's younger than you. So yes. How old is she?
Yeah, so my sister, let's see, how old am I? 21. She just turned 20.
Okay.
Sorry. So she got married last summer, so summer of 2023. So she got married about a month or two after she turned 19. So she is all in. She was married in the temple, did the whole thing. And what was really hard about that, because this was right before I really moved into kind of really questioning things, I wasn't able to go see her get married. Yeah. Because I wasn't going through, I hadn't gone through the temple, and obviously like a limited use recommend doesn't work for that. And so it was really hard to be like, I'm still living a good life and I can't see my sister decide to like marry the love of her life. You know?
No, I'm glad you're sharing that. And for listeners who are maybe not Mormon, so with the LDS church and the Mormon temple, the only people that can go to the temple are what worthy recommend holders. So those are members of the church that are following all the rules. And that's kind of what Emily's talking about. And I think this is a really real phenomenon, is unless you're that worthy temple recommend holder and of age, you can't see family members get married. And I think about just marriage in outside of this culture. It is this celebration. It is this union, and how like sad you didn't get to celebrate this in the same way for your sister.
Yeah.
Because of rules that just really don't make sense, in my opinion.
I definitely agree. And I think it's, again, because then there's that piece of you that feels like, well, like, am I good enough? Like, there's this piece of like, well, I'm not qualified to go to this ceremony. Am I good enough as a person? And it kind of hits you a little bit harder, where it's like, wait, no, I actually am a good person. I just don't meet this specific organization's list of criteria. So
yeah, no, thank you for sharing that. I think there's so many people that have navigated that within Mormonism, within Mormon culture, of not being able to witness family members get married. I'm curious to, because Emily and I've already told you this 100 times today, I can see that you've embodied deconstruction in my mind, in the sense that you have this way about you, the way you're showing up in here with me, and like you've done a lot of your own inner work. And I know you have done internal family systems, and internal family systems is IFS. We've talked about it a lot. I've talked about it a lot on this podcast. And I want you to speak more on that if you're comfortable with it, because I think I can talk about it from a therapist lens, but to have you talk about it from a client lens and just your experience in doing therapy. And so I guess in conjunction with that question, you had this like big awakening. You were empty. You felt empty. And then how did you dive into how did the therapy come into your realm? Like, how did you get support from here?
Yeah. So I was actually already in therapy at this point.
Okay.
I had been in therapy I had done therapy previously in high school, and then was back. I was about 8 months into another kind of, we did it, I was good, and then I went back, and I was in therapy during that process. And something that really helped me with that emptiness, especially with IFS, is, for those of you who don't know what IFS is, it's another body-based approach to therapy. So you dive into the different parts of yourself that hold on to experiences, trauma, beliefs about yourself. The best way I can describe it is, I don't know if you've seen the new Inside Out movie. They have this like self with all these little strings, and IFS is going in and kind of plucking all of those strings and being curious about each of them. What belief do they hold, and how do they contribute to your one self? And so as we were navigating that, it was very much obvious that all of these pieces of myself were so deeply rooted in the messaging I received in Mormonism, and especially like around self-worth and anything that had to do with how I felt about myself, whether that was body image, whether it was how I showed up as a leader, how I just showed up as Emily. It was all tied into this like worthiness messaging. And so what we did was, it's a very imagery focused therapy. So we go and you get curious about this part. Where do you feel it? What does it look like? Does it look like you? What age is it? And it was this very like tumultuous circumstance in my brain. It felt like I was standing in the middle of a hurricane, and it was just all of this messaging of, you're only worthy if you do this. You're only worthy if you do that. Your only like meaning in life comes from this. And so really kind of diving into that and reminding that piece of myself that my worth is inherent. Like everybody just has worth as a person. I love the analogy. I can't remember where it was shared from, but everybody is just one. Like there's nothing in your life that you can do to make you go to 0, and there's nothing you can do in life to make you go to 2. Everybody just is one. Everybody just has worth. Nobody has more or less worth than anybody else. And that really shifted my perspective in myself, because now my worth was no longer tied to a set of conditions. It was just me, and it was just tied to my being.
Yeah, that's really powerful. And I think what was coming up for me when you were talking is, and it's hard to like tell people what worthiness trauma is.
Yeah.
Right? But you just told us, right? This is what happens when you belong to a culture that says this is what makes you worthy. Mm-hmm. So you know, as you were talking, you're like, well, I'm only worthy if this and this and this. And it takes away from just the essence of like, no, you're worthy just as you are.
Yeah. And
it gets so complicated and convoluted, and it gets into all different facets of our being. Mm-hmm. Where we don't feel that we're worthy. And that's, in my opinion, why worthiness standards are so harmful and why they cause trauma, because they disrupt our ability to actually know that we are worthy.
Yeah, absolutely. And it really disconnects you just from yourself, because now everything about yourself is tied to these conditions. And so navigating that emptiness is because all of my being was tied to these conditions. And so in the process of reconstructing that, it was the realization that, well, I don't have to let go of this value. I just need to reframe it so it's not tied to a religious organization. I still really value integrity and honesty and kindness and service. I just practice them differently now. And I think that that's really what filled up that emptiness after that. Because now my self-worth and my understanding of myself was no longer tied to an organization. It was tied to me and how I practice that outwardly.
And what's coming up for me as you're sharing this is you're doing it for you, not for them.
Absolutely.
Right? You're having integrity because integrity is meaningful for you, mm-hmm. not because that's what the religion is telling you to do. Mm-hmm. And I think that is very different. Absolutely. And there's a lot more authenticity in that when mm-hmm. you get to just show up and have integrity because it's actually a value you believe in, mm-hmm. versus a value you've been told you have to believe in order to be like the best most worthy version of yourself.
Yeah. And with that, I think it allows you to show up more intentionally. It's no longer a checklist. It's no longer, okay, to practice service, I have to hold a calling or clean the church every Saturday or Sunday or whatever, or do these things. And that, like, you practice those values within the church. There's not a lot of room, I feel like, for you to practice it outside, especially in Utah, because the church is so ingrained in the culture that if you're volunteering at a pantry, it's going to be the LDS like storehouse, right?
Yeah.
So it's so ingrained in that those values just are ricocheted back. It's to the church, to you, to the church, to you. Where when you get to step outside of that, it's like, oh, I have the opportunity to go to a public library or a queer-owned business, or all of these things where you can put your time and your energy, or in relationships that can be different. There's less judgment there because you're showing up intentionally because they matter to you, not because you're told that they should matter to you.
Yeah. And what's coming up for me, and you're giving me like language to what I've felt within my being of, I actually feel like my values, my integrity, the way I show up in the world, my ability to encounter spiritual experiences increased exponentially after leaving a high control religion. And I don't think I've ever made the connection of, like, I still embody those values that the church teaches us about, but I actually embody them. Like, they're actually my values.
Yeah.
And that we all have within us. And I think that's even my message to so many people listening, because I hear this all the time. How am I going to teach my kids morals? How am I going to teach my kids values if I don't belong to a religion? And I'm just going to tell you, you're actually going to probably teach them a lot better if you don't belong to that religion, because the religion is corrupting the values.
Absolutely, yes.
Because it says like, these are things you have to do. And so we naturally have like a little fight in us.
Yeah, absolutely.
You know, I don't know, like this is a really powerful conversation, because I've always felt that, like, I've always thought I have a lot more integrity now than ever did as a member of the church. But it's just this felt experience of, oh, well, that's always been in me.
Yeah. It's like, it's so ingrained in you that you don't have to let it go. You just have to shift it a little bit.
Yeah. Which is so powerful. And it's just the reframe.
Absolutely.
Of, I don't belong to this church anymore. I'm not a member, because I don't know if you ever belong. I'm going to take that word out. I'm not a member of this church anymore, but I still have integrity. I still believe in service.
Yeah.
It's powerful.
It definitely is. And I think, I know the youth program has changed, but when I was growing up, it was all those personal progress values like faith, divine nature, individual worth, and all those. And I still hold so much space for those. And I still value knowledge and accountability and these pieces. I just do it in a different way. And I think it makes it so much bigger than myself now. It's not as big as the church anymore. It's bigger than that.
Yeah. And this conversation, I think, is powerful, because you don't have, deconstruction does not mean you have to shed everything.
Yeah.
You actually don't even have to shed any of it. You just reintegrate it into your own being in a way that's supportive for you.
Yeah.
And doesn't have to be dictated by what men, because that's the leadership, that's who's getting modern day revelation. That's the founders of the religion have said, this is what you need to believe.
Exactly.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing that. I know that message alone is going to resonate with a lot of people. And it even gives me a sense of hope in helping other people navigate this too. And like, what are some of the things you learned in church that you actually really enjoyed?
Yeah.
That were really meaningful to you? And it's like, how do we bring that into your present life that's not at church?
Exactly. And I think that's something that can be hard post deconstruction, is it's how do you hold space for the goodness that you saw while being religious, and also the hurt that is caused by religion, and just the pain of deconstructing in general. And I think that that's the answer, is it's you get to reframe this and hold this, and there you can appreciate the beauty of it, and you can appreciate that you learned how to be the one that showed up first to set up all the chairs, and you learned how to be the one to stay after and help clean up. You learned how to communicate and be a public speaker. I think that that's really valuable, even though it's terrifying to get up in front of a congregation and try and speak for God in some extent. You learn some really important skills that are really transferable, and it's okay to have space for that and say that that was something that was valuable.
Yeah, I'm just in awe right now, because I think this conversation is really powerful and you embody it well. And what's coming up for me, and I'm super curious, because I think this is a difficult thing to do when you grow up in a high control religion that's very black and white. Part of people leaving can be like, I have to hate it all. I have to throw it all away. And maybe that there is a phase of that for a second. But what we're talking about is very gray, is very in the middle. Absolutely. And it doesn't have to, there is not one right way to navigate this. So I'm curious, Emily, what has allowed you to find the gray? What has allowed you to find this like nuanced view of, I can take all of these skills and things that I learned and reintegrate them in my life? Because I imagine that might have been difficult.
Yeah, it was really difficult. I would just like to thank a close friend and family member of mine who has really been pinnacle in this journey for me. they really brought this idea of grayness to my understanding. And what we did is at the beginning of the year, we created vision boards and value boards. And so we picked 4 values or 4 or 5, however many resonate with you, that we either had and wanted to work on or something new. And so let me pull up the ones that I had selected. And we decided to work on those. And so that way it feels a little less overwhelming of, I need to bring all of these good pieces back and rebuild all of it. It's just one thing at a time. And in doing that, it allowed me to be like, okay, I have learned this skill. It's tied to religion. That's really painful. What's another way that I can practice that and check in with myself often? So do like a weekly check-in on how I'm incorporating that value into my life. Is it actually helping? Do I need to shift it a little bit? And so I think that that's really what helped me find the grayness. I think also leaving the church, you really experience just humanness, and like you see everybody just as a human, and you don't see them through the lens of, are they living up to these Mormon standards or not? And everybody is a little gray if you think about it. Everybody has their pieces that are good and bad depending on how you frame it. Everybody's life is subjective. Everybody's experience is different. And everybody's just a little gray. And I think that that allows me to see people in a very less judgmental way and just realize that it is the human experience to be in the gray. Like nobody is perfect and nobody is going to be this amazing example of everything good or an example of everything that's bad, right? I think there's a lot of grayness in that. And so then just finding what works for you. So sorry, I'm going to jump back a little bit. So these values that I decided to work on was connectedness, novelty, calmness, and intentionality. And so how am I bringing those in and using them in because sometimes I fail at these really hard, and other days I do a really great job. And I think just holding a lot of space and a lot of patience. And you've brought up curiosity a lot too, of like, is this serving me? Is it not? Where does this apply in my life?
I want to take a moment to tell you guys about a new product I'm using called Prana Mat. I've been using this mat for the last month, and it has been such a game changer for me in regards to decompressing, releasing stress, getting better sleep, and even noticing some more muscular tone in my body. I love the mat because it gets directly into my nervous system. It's a way to do a body-based approach that's very quick and efficient and only requires about 5 to 10 minutes. To learn more, visit pranamat.com and use Ashley B at checkout for a special discount code. Yeah, curiosity is my favorite word. Just be curious. I say it all the time. If you are my client, I'm a broken record of being curious. And what's coming up for me, Emily, and listening to you talk and share all of this is you embody curiosity. To me, what's allowed you to have patience and I would call grace for yourself is this curious lens to be curious and put all of the things out on the table. And okay, like I learned this growing up. This is meaningful to me. Let me see how it feels without the context of religion, right? How is it showing up for me? What's happening for me? And allowing yourself to be curious is allowing you to find the gray, to be present in the here and now and not having to be on one side or the other.
Yeah.
And I would imagine does that allow you to hold space for members of the church in a different way too? Because you have a lot of family members that are still members.
Yeah, I think it does. And I'm just going to jump back to the IFS stuff a little bit because you find this piece, and the main part of IFS is curiosity. You meet these pieces of yourself that are holding on to trauma or holding on to messaging really, really curiously. Why are you holding on to this? And this piece of me with this really, really intense Mormon messaging of self-worth was doing what it thought was right and doing what it thought was good to protect me and to keep me safe in the organization I was a part of. And so in doing that, you have to approach it and say, like, thank you for keeping me safe and for taking this messaging to heart, because that is what I needed at that time in my life. Now I still value what you do as a part of myself. Here's how I'm going to give you a different role now moving forward. You're going to hold on to these values. We're going to practice them in a different way. And so I think especially seeing family members and friends who are still in the church, it gives me that grace of knowing that they have that same messaging that's just trying to keep them safe.
Oh, that's beautiful. And that's what I get to a lot. And again, I say this with the caveat that, yes, members of the church have those parts, those wounds, and that also doesn't justify mistreatment.
Absolutely.
I also think healing and moving through from deconstruction to reconstruction to holding space for yourself, and this doesn't even just apply to members of the church. It really applies to anyone who has done harm to you in some capacity, is I think being able to recognize that they are wounded people.
Yeah, well, you have talked a lot about this generational trauma in Mormonism, and I think that that's a great example of that. I think when I was Mormon, you look at pioneer ancestors as it's beautiful the sacrifice they had. It's beautiful that they suffered for this religion. And when I deconstructed, I flipped 180 and I was like, they committed genocide against the Native Americans. They did a lot of harm. They settled land not in the most ethical of ways, and all of these things. And when you talk about this generational trauma in Mormonism, it brings in that space of these people were also suffering. Does that excuse their behavior? Absolutely not. But it allows me to say, okay, they were suffering and their coping mechanism was religious affiliation. And that's what was keeping them safe. Because if you're traveling across the plains without your family and you decide to leave, you're stuck in the middle of the Utah desert with nothing and no one. And so holding that space, I think, I love that example because I think it's a great way to explain that. It's not an excuse, but people were still being harmed.
Yeah. And it really helps. And this is for even my own personal inner work on both sides of my family. So my dad's side of the family is not, they have no affiliation to the Mormon church. And it's really allowed me to have compassion and empathy for the traumas and things that have happened in my relationship with my dad. And it doesn't justify my dad's behavior. I mean, my dad and I are currently estranged, and it doesn't justify his behavior, but I still get to understand it and know it was never about me. And there is power in that, right? To know that, like, if your parent, and not saying your parents are mistreating you, right? But like if certain members of the church are saying something to you and they're like, I get it all the time on my social media, right? It's not about me. It's about their pain. And it doesn't excuse the bad behavior, but I think it allows you as the person that's healing to step back and be like, okay, they're hurt people. Do they have the capacity to get help? Maybe they do, but maybe they don't. And maybe that's how you figure out and create a boundary.
And I think that is something that's really powerful because it allows you to, it shows the reflection of how much inner work you've done. If you think about doing inner work and you think about reconstructing and you think about all these things, it's like going to the gym. It's not until that moment where you encounter somebody who says something and you're like, wait, that comes from a place that I've healed, that it's like, I'm actually seeing the gains of doing this inner work and doing that. I remember I was at a family gathering a few months into what I would consider reconstruction, and there was a comment made that I later talked to my boyfriend about, and I was like, this was like, I see this very differently than I would have deconstructing, or very differently than I would as I was Mormon. And it's like, I finally feel like I'm getting there, like I'm finally seeing it. And it's like it's this steady work that you'll start to see as you continue to work through it.
Me and Emily are wise beyond your years. Like, I'm so here for this conversation. You give me a lot of hope too, just for what's happening for younger generations and what you're tuning into and what is possible when you do this inner work. I have to circle. This question came up for me, and and if you're like, no, I don't want to answer it, that's totally fine. I am curious because you were in therapy prior to like the empty feeling. Was your therapist a member of the church?
My therapist was a member of the church.
Okay.
So
I'm so actually really grateful that you're bringing this up because it's a question I get all the time. And tell me about it. Tell me about your therapist that was a member of the church. How did that go?
I'm so glad you asked this because I just listened to your episode where you talked about therapists being human and the question of, can you be like a good therapist to somebody who is Mormon or vice versa? And my therapist is literally an angel on this earth. I don't believe in any deity, but if there is such, he specifically made her for me as like my therapist. She is amazing. And what was beautiful about that is there was never a moment where I felt like I couldn't tell her about deconstruction. There was never a moment where I felt like I couldn't come into a session and say, I am feeling really hurt by this, especially when we were doing IFS and it was me sobbing and feeling broken because I was told that I wasn't worthy because I had been doing things throughout my adolescence and into early adulthood that had quote unquote disqualified me from exaltation. And she had so much grace and so much space, and never once did I ever feel like that there was judgment there in any way. She was so, there's no word to describe just how amazing and open she was to hearing me and seeing me, even though I know it was probably really difficult for her to see a client deconstruct a religion that she really believed in. And I saw her as an active Mormon and then later as a deconstructed Mormon. And so I'm sure it was really difficult. I don't know her experience in any way, but just knowing what I would have experienced as seeing somebody go through that process would probably be really difficult. But there wasn't ever a session where I came in being like, I don't feel like I can talk to her about this. Like, she's not going to be able to handle that. Like, no, she is a professional and able to hold that space because she knows that it's what's best for me.
Yeah, I mean, I just want to say this for listeners. This is how a therapeutic relationship is meant to feel.
Absolutely.
And it goes both ways, right? You know, sometimes we have to work through our own activation and be able to say, hey, I'm feeling a little unsafe in here, right? And also, you know, a therapist who is attuned, who is confronting their own biases, who's doing their own inner work, can hold space for you, even if they believe differently.
Yeah.
And that is so evident in what you're sharing. And I say it all the time. It does not, a therapist's religious beliefs should not matter in the therapeutic process. What matters is exactly what Emily was speaking to. Do you feel safe to come and open up and share and be vulnerable? And if you don't be safe, curiosity, why is that? Is that your own activation? Is it the therapist? And it's okay to say that out loud. I mean, if I have a client that ever comes to me and says like, hey, I don't feel safe in here, I'm like, thank you so much for telling me what's going on. Is it something in our dynamic? Maybe I need to refer you out. Is there other options? And that's like, that, in my opinion, if you bring that to your therapist, if you're saying, I don't feel comfortable talking about my faith deconstruction, how they respond to you will tell you whether they're the right fit or not.
Absolutely. Like, therapist shopping, 10 out of 10. Do it. Like, it is worth taking the time to find the person that you connect with and are willing to be open and truthful with, no matter who they are as an individual outside of that. Like, this is their professional capacity. You're not going to a bishop whose role is to be a spiritual leader. You're not going to any of these other spaces in church leadership where their role is to keep you in the church. You're going to somebody who is there to make sure that you are mentally healthy and doing the best that you can to feel safe in yourself.
Yes. And what I love is that therapist can be an LDS therapist, a Mormon therapist, and help you deconstruct your faith and hold space for you in a safe way. And I know that this is not true for every therapist. Yes. This is not true for any therapist. Their therapist harm is a real thing. But I would invite you to just be curious about meeting, trying out a few different therapists and being okay that they might have a certain religious belief, but if they're not imposing it on you, good therapy does, you don't really know, or you might know, but it doesn't really matter. I actually have quite a few Mormon clients on my caseload. It's very well known that I'm not Mormon, especially on social media these days, right? But I am never going to tell a client to leave their religion. I'm never going to tell a client to stay or to go back.
Yeah.
I'm just going to meet you in the moment. I'm going to hold space for you as you work through the really dark, hard things, just like this therapist did with you.
Yep.
And you're going to figure out what you need, and I'm going to support you in that. That is my role as a clinician.
Absolutely. And from a client perspective, like, that's exactly what you need. Like, I remember coming to my therapist, there was some really hard trauma, And it's like, do you want to talk about this today? And there were days I would say no, and she's like, okay, we'll talk about something else. And we just move on. Like,
Yep.
It's very, very client-led. And if you have a therapist who is willing to do that, that's what makes the difference.
Yes. And I would say most body-based approaches are very client-led.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because it's mostly them kind of just grounding you and helping you be curious. You're in your head, especially with IFS. For me, a lot of it was like closing my eyes and visualization of my inner being, right?
Yeah.
And so it's just her reminding me that I'm not going to get stuck in my head. Okay, what does this look like? What does it feel like? And it's like me then giving this information and her just kind of like more like holding my hand as I walk through this journey.
Yeah. That's exactly what I would describe brain spotting to be. I'm a space holder. I'm following my client's nervous system and allowing and encouraging them to be curious, to be open, but I'm never directing. I'm never telling us where to go unless it's like, hey, I'm noticing you're being a little judgmental right now. Let's be a little curious, right? Let's be open to the sensations that are coming up. And I think even if you're not doing a body-based therapy, searching or seeking out a therapist that is inviting that curiosity and openness is such a good measure. I'm glad we got into this part of the conversation because it's not very often. I mean, I can sit here and talk and be like, no, there's good therapists out there that belong to every religion, right? But I really appreciate the opportunity to have a client say like, no, I actually, my therapist was a part of this faith that I deconstructed and reconstructed. So thank you so much for that, Emily.
Yeah, of course. So
I do want to get into some questions. Let me get my paper. So that's one part of Sunflower Movement is I take submissions from the audience, and I love it because it just gives me an opportunity to expand, and I love expanding with my guests just to offer different perspectives. So these questions are pertaining to faith deconstruction, and I'm going to even call it like faith reconstruction. That's like really coming up for me a lot is like, how do you reconstruct your faith after you've deconstructed it? So I'll start with this one. The first two kind of go together, but I'll read them separately. So number 1, what to replace the emptiness with after deconstruction? The faith I have been raised in has been my reason to live, or better, my reason not to die for all of my teenage years and onward. I don't believe it anymore, but I sometimes hit this wall of, then what is this life for? What's my purpose? Do I have a purpose? Were my kids meant to be mine since before any of us were born? Is there any deeper meaning or plan in anything? And if there isn't, then what? What about the moments when I felt loved and cared for and believed that I had a special mission in this life? When I could feel that conviction deep in my bones, did all of that mean nothing? Was it all a part of this emotional, psychological manipulation we all did to each other to feel belonging? How to answer and come to terms with these world-moving questions if the religion you grew up in doesn't fit anymore.
Oh, wow. There's a lot to unpack there. So
there's a lot.
Yes, but that's okay. I wrote down some notes. I'm going to just pull up just so I can make sure I'm staying in line for the question. So again, there's a lot to unpack there. And I'm just going to be really open right now. In my phase of life now, I truly believe that life is meaningless, but not in the sense that life doesn't have any meaning. Like, I get to create that meaning now. It is not like a cynical, life is meaningless, I'm going to get stuck in the dump and despair. I get to create that meaning for myself. So if being stuck in this place of not knowing your purpose or not having this like divine mission, who's to say that you don't? You get to decide that for yourself. It's no longer given to you, which is hard. Establishing that for yourself can be difficult because it's not given to you to say, this is your mission as a woman in this organization or as a person in this organization. You get to create that for yourself. And I think that that is the most beautiful part of it all because, yeah, it's really hard to lose the meaning that was just given to you. It's really easy to look and say, okay, I need to be doing X, Y, and Z. But it's even more beautiful to be able to create that for yourself. Life is meant to be lived in the here and the now, and you get to do that.
Yeah, and what's coming up for me is when you belong to a high control religion like Mormonism, there's no space for that. Because everything's predetermined. You have your entire life mapped out for you of what you're expected to do. Things are quote unquote very certain. And now what I'm seeing when I read this question, the submission is like, you're feeling really uncertain, which is so valid.
Absolutely.
Just want to see you in that. Whoever submitted this, I just want to see you in that uncertainty. But to me, that uncertainty is also your freedom. It is your opportunity to learn, to be curious, to be open to uncertainty and how it shows up in your life, and allowing it to be a teacher, a place to grow, a place to tune into, like, just like Emily was saying, what does make my life meaningful? Because it can genuinely be anything.
Yeah. And so I don't have any children, but I'd love to touch on this point of where my kids' mind to, like, predetermined. Like, you made them. Like, they came from you. You get to decide what is meaningful in that relationship. Like, there's a part of you in that, and they have this beautiful piece of you that you can cultivate and grow and teach them these values and teach them the meaning of life and give them the freedom to create that for themselves. Like, I mean, I look at me and my siblings, and we are all vastly different, but it's still really beautiful, because that now my space is a little bit more open than my siblings being in high demand religion, but we've been able to cultivate those different parts of ourselves. And when you do that and really think about, this is a part of me that is really beautiful that I've given to them, how can I cultivate something that's going to grow and manifest in a really beautiful and meaningful way?
Yeah. And what's also coming up for me as you bring up the kids too, it's like, you need to know, like, what happened before, and now you need to know what happened after. And then what's missing, you're not in the middle.
Yeah.
Right? You're not in the middle of what's happening right in front of you. And I think that is where you find what it is you're looking for. Like, you know, how do you come to terms with it? I think you come to terms with it by coming right now to the here and now with what is happening right in front of you and making meaning out of that. And you're never going to know what came before. I mean, there's a lot of, I mean, the church does this very well to talk about the pre-existence, right?
Yes.
And then the church does really well to talk about the afterlife. And that is why it has so many members.
Yeah.
Because we want certainty as humans. And if there's anything I've learned in my own inner work and working with so many clients, life is uncertain. And it has always been uncertain. Even when you belong to a high control religion, life is still uncertain. Things are going to happen that you can't make sense of. And when you belong to a religious belief that says, oh no, this is how we make sense of it, that's why you stay. It's a trauma response, in my opinion, because to leave and to have to sit with this uncertainty that's coming up in this question is very uncomfortable. You have to build a muscle around it. Like, you have to get used to it. You have to work it out, and you have to hold space for it and not fight with it. And that is really difficult to do. And also, when you can do it, it is incredibly powerful. It grounds you. It regulates you. It gives you hope to know that it's going to be okay. Yeah. Because you're right here in the moment.
Absolutely. The being present part is so key. And I think, although it is hard to be in that uncertainty, there comes a point where it becomes a little bit lighter to hold, because now you're no longer living for an afterlife qualification. You're no longer focused on the what happens after I die. Am I going to make it to this heaven? You just get to be here. And I feel like that is the most beautiful part of it.
Yeah, same. Okay, number 2. What I'm struggling the most with is the unknown. When I was in the church, I knew exactly what would happen or not happen if I made this choice or chose not to do something. If I pay a full tithe, I will never go without, or if I don't get seated in the temple, I will live in eternity without those I love. I knew there was a God. I knew I would see my loved ones again. I've recently lost my sister to suicide. It's the uncertainty. I'm not going to change the way I make choices. I will continue to live in this world as a good human being, not just a good Mormon. So the support I could use right now is where to find comfort and peace in the midst of the uncertainty. I think we already answered this question. I also just want to touch on and recognize the loss of your sister to suicide, and just thank you for sharing that. And I hold space for that. It's such a heavy loss and such a hard burden to bear for those that are experiencing those types of thoughts and that level of distress. And I can imagine what's probably coming up a lot too is you grew up in a religion that told you this is how, you would see your loved ones again, and now that's gone. I don't know if there's anything else you would add, Emily.
Yeah, I think I would just say, like, with this being in the present, what are some like rituals that this person could establish in their life to have that connection? You know, I think I'm a very like tangible action person. Like, it needs to be something that I do on a regular basis. And so with grief specifically, grief is a difficult process to navigate, whether you're religious or not. Like, whether you believe families are forever or not, it is still really, really damn hard to lose somebody you love. And I think what is most important is finding that connectedness with your sister, this listener's sister. What's a way that you can connect with her that may not be tied to a religious belief system? Is there a song that really resonated with her? Is there something in nature that reminds you of her? Is there these things that you could do to continue to cultivate that connection in whatever kind of spirituality sense that they might believe in? But I think establishing those rituals to bring meaning and to be grounded allow you to be okay in the uncertainty.
Yeah, no, I love that. And I would just invite this person to be really curious too about that can be anything and that can look like anything too, right? And it might not come to you right away, but I think if you hold space for it and you realize like, I can feel connected to my sister, it's not going to look in the way that I was always told that connection was going to be, or that people said was going to be, because again, we have no proof of what the afterlife is really like, but just being curious about what are the ways in which this person is showing up in your life in the here and now. And I mean, I'm going to just speak to the things that really help me with uncertainty, and they're all in the here and now. It's the moments when I'm really present with my kids and I'm playing a game with them, or we're laughing, or when my husband gets home from work and I give him a big hug, or like honestly my morning coffee in the morning, like just sitting down and knowing I'm going to wake up to a cup of coffee. And it's for me, it's been tuning into the moment and just being right here, right now, because I don't know what's going to happen tomorrow. And that used to terrify me. That used to terrify me so much. And not even because of high control religion, but because I had a very dysregulated nervous system. And so I was always like, kind of like waiting for the next shoe to drop. And as I've regulated my nervous system more, and I've done some really intense inner work, I actually find like the messy, uncertain moments to be like the ones that I'm like, oh, okay, this is life. Like, this is what it means to be human. Like, my kids are running around screaming and it's a lot. And also, this is so temporary. This is like probably a TMI share, but like my youngest is like now potty trained, and my oldest is like obviously way potty trained. But my youngest is like, Mom, come wipe my bum. And I was like, I laughed, and then I told my husband, I was like, hey, do you remember when Bo's my oldest, used to do that, and now he doesn't do it anymore because he wipes his own bum? And like this, like of the wiping of the bum is just a temporary thing. And so it's about, I don't think I would have really tuned into those moments had I been just living for tomorrow. So I think part of navigating the uncertainty is like, what in today, right now, you know, if you're listening to this, what in today, right now, is just like feels grounded for you? What feels connected? Like, who are you looking at right now? What are you looking at? What are you doing as you're listening to this podcast? Who's in your life in the here and now that brings you peace and joy, right?
Yeah, I love that. I really appreciate you sharing those moments of meaning, and as silly as they can be. I remember the first time I ever saw a rainbow after leaving the church, and I always used to conceptualize rainbows as kind of God's little like, hey, Emily, like, I'm looking out for you. And in that moment, it was like, oh, no, the world's just beautiful. And I get to allow that to mean what it is. It's like, it's really cool that water and light are able to create something so beautiful. And now it no longer is a sign of a deity to me. It's now just a sign of this beautiful experience that I get to live. And being in Cedar, for those of you who've never been to Cedar, come visit, because it is one of the most beautiful places in the world, I would say, with the red rock and the mountains. It just, you look at it and it just, that's what grounds me, is being able to look around and say, this is just this beautiful world in the here and now. Like, I'm not worried about where it came from, or where, I'm a little worried about where it's going, but I mean, but like in the sense of a religious capacity, I think now it's just beauty. And being able to see that and appreciate the little things as something that's here and now is really regulating and really grounding.
Yeah, no, I love that. And like rainbows. Well, I'm never going to look at a rainbow the same because of this conversation. And I love that because that to me also becomes spiritual, right? Yeah. I had this like really meaningful conversation with Emily that I'll never forget. And then every time I see a rainbow, I'm going to think of you. and that's how you make meaning, right? And so like I've told this story on another episode, but my best friend who I went to, my college roommate, she lost her mom when she was 15. Mm-hmm. And she was like the first person I was around that like talked openly about death. Mm-hmm. And we've been friends. So, I mean, like half my life now, right? I'm not trying to age myself, but I was 18 a long time ago. And she would call her mom Jillbug. And every time when she'd see a ladybug, it'd be like, oh, my mom's here. Yeah. And it's to this day, like I see a ladybug and I've never even met her mom. Like her mom passed way before we ever were roommates, but it's like, oh, your mom's here with me. Yeah. So I have to have this connection to a woman that I have never met because of these kind of conversations, this openness to like being connected to something bigger than ourselves, even if we don't know what that thing is. Yeah. And that's what a rainbow is. That's what a ladybug is. That's like what a sunflower is to me, right? You know, we all have these things and I think they're really, really powerful. All right, Emily, how do you feel about jumping into one more question?
Let's do it.
We have time. So let's do it. Okay. Lately, I've learned a lot about the church's shady past and cover-ups, and I'm in disbelief. Learning about things like the salamander letter is not only hurtful, but makes me so mad. Maybe I'm being naive, but I feel like if my siblings read the CES letter, they would not stay Mormon. Should I talk to them about it? So far, none of them seem to be questioning anything. I don't want to be the reason their shelf breaks and have to carry the blame guilt. However, at the same time, it's hurtful to see them supporting and loving something that feels so wrong and harmful to me. Should I tell them what I really believe about the church or stay silent to keep the peace? Before we keep going, can you tell me what the salamander letter is?
I can do my best.
Okay.
I believe that it was a letter, quote unquote, proving that Joseph Smith was a fraud.
Okay.
But it ended up, so I might be getting this wrong. So if anybody wants to correct me, please add this to the comments at some capacity. It's been a minute since I've done this research. But it was a letter that supposedly showcased Joseph Smith as a fraud. And the church was kind of working in the black market to get this letter out of...
I think I've actually heard about it
out
now.
of like common consumption to like hide it from people. And I believe they ended up getting it, but then it turned out to, I believe, be a fake letter. And so then it was this whole thing about the church trying to cover up that Joseph Smith was a fraud, but the letter itself was a fraud. And so it was this really big conspiracy. I believe it was in like the 1980s where that really kind of came to light. I believe there's a documentary on Netflix about it.
I've actually watched it now that we're talking about it.
So it's been a few years.
Yes, same. Sometimes that's how my memory works. It gets jogged. But I pulled this question because of everything else. I was like, I don't know what the salamander letter is, but I have a feeling Emily might know. And we all know. So CES letters keep getting referenced. Can you share what those are too for listeners that are maybe not Mormon?
Yeah, the CES letter, I could not tell you what the acronym stands for.
That's fine. You don't have to.
But however many years ago it was, there was a student at BYU who was asked by a professor to bring in some questions about the church. And so the CES letter is essentially this individual's research and paper given to the professor saying, hey, these things don't make sense in the church doctrine, in the Book of Mormon, in the Doctrine and Covenants, Pearl of Great Price, all these pieces of the church. It's like, this doesn't make sense, or this doesn't make sense in church history. And when it was turned in, I'm sure there's so much complexities to these stories. Forgive me for just giving a summary. He was then excommunicated for turning in that letter. And no answer was ever actually given. No response from the church answering any of those questions. So it's really that and A Letter to My Wife have very similar content. If you are new to the deconstruction world, I would recommend A Letter to My Wife instead. I feel like it is connotated in a more like soft padding kind of way of kind of introducing you to things in the church doctrine and in the Book of Mormon that are inherently wrong. And the CES letter, again, they have very similar information, but it's really the like the canon event
No,
of leaving the church. Is you read that and it's like, oh wait.
Yeah, I ask that because I didn't even know about this stuff when I left the church. So I left the church purely on like felt experiences of it not aligning with my being.
Yeah.
And I didn't really dive into this type of, and I never read the CES letters because by the time I'd heard about them, I had been out for 10 years and it didn't matter.
Yeah.
But so I'm not an expert and I can't speak on them. So I appreciate you sharing that. And I think it's like, and that's also what I want to point out. Some people don't have to read the CES letters to leave. And some people, that is what like breaks their shelf. Right.
Yeah.
And so I want to get to this question. What comes up for you, because you are the oldest and you have younger siblings? Should this person tell them what he or she really believes, or should they stay silent? And I think that's a very black and white question, so maybe there's more of a gray answer.
Yes, I'm going to give a black and white answer first and then expand in the gray. This might be a little controversial, but I'm going to say no. Because here's what happens. When you are in a high control religion, many of us, like me and you both experience being in high control religion. I'm sure many listeners have. If you're never Mormon, I'm so happy for you. But when you are in this organization, the messaging is that media, such as the CES letter, comes from Satan. I was told my whole life that the CES letter was anti-Mormon propaganda, and reading it meant that I was being deceived by the devil and that it was this horrendous thing. And I actually was scared to ever come across it. Like, I would never even Google anything that had to do with it. Like, I only ever heard about it in the connotation that it was a negative thing that makes people leave because it's Satan tempting you out. And so when you're in this experience of leaving and your faith is deconstructed and you see the harm that is being caused by this organization to people you love, you want to do everything you can to get them out of it. Like, I see that in my own family, and there's part of me that just wants to grab them by the shoulders and just say, can you see what's happening? But if I think of myself when I was Mormon, I would see it as anti-Mormon propaganda that is Satan tempting me. You cannot digest anything post-Mormon, especially the CES letter and church history, until you have just a tiny little crack in the door open.
Yes.
The door is shut the whole time you are in Mormonism, because every single thing that you're hearing is all about the church being true, it being the one and only true church, and everything else being from Satan. And there's so much fear in that. And so as much as I would love to say to this person, yes, go show them, they will leave and you all can live a happy post-Mormon life together, it just can't happen.
And I'm gonna share my perspective from a trauma lens. Is for everything Emily is sharing, unless that crack's there, not listening is a trauma response, right? Yeah. Believing that what you're sharing with me is from Satan is like, I have to believe that, because to not believe that means I have to, right? It's that whole empty identity, everything you've ever known is gone.
Yeah. And
that is so heavy.
Absolutely.
And our nervous system will do whatever it takes to keep us safe, to keep us from feeling that level of distress. So not being ready to hear that the church, quote unquote, isn't true, or there's lots of fake things, or there's been lots of deception, not being ready to hear that is a trauma response, and it keeps people safe. And I think I see you, I'm with you. I want to shake so many people. I want to do a lot of things, right? But I would invite you to be curious about where that's coming from, because what comes up for me is, to this person, how are you feeling about your deconstruction? Right? Because obviously we want other people to be deconstructing with us. There's solidarity in that. There's comfort in that, especially people we love that we see are being hurt. And I would just really invite you to take that energy, all that energy that you want to give to them, and give it back to yourself, and tune into your own being, and tune into your own reconstruction process that we've been talking about a lot today, and go that way and work with that, and then maybe circle back to some of this, because you might be able to present it in a way that is more open and more curious than coming from a place of like, you need to read this, you need to get out, right? We're almost like in fight or flight when we're doing that.
Yeah.
Okay. Emily, thank you so much for this conversation today and just all of your insight about the reconstruction process. I know it's going to be so helpful to everyone listening. And I just really, really appreciate you coming on and sharing your personal experience. You have been so vulnerable and so authentic, and you have given me so much grace. And I know I've said that 100 times, but just like the respect I have for you is huge. And I would love to have you come back on again in the future. Next time you're in Cedar City, please let me know. I always like to ask this, is there like any other like final things you want to make sure you say before we close today? Anything you want to leave for the listeners?
Yeah, absolutely. I just would love to say, those of you who are in active deconstruction or shifting into reconstruction, like, just remember that this is what this community is here for. It feels really lonely, and it is lonely because it is your own messaging and your own internal work that you have to do, but you don't have to do it by yourself. That's what this community is here for. And there's spaces popping up on social media and hopefully within your communities. And if not, maybe this is your opportunity to kind of pave the way in that. Ashley, you're doing that down here in Southern Utah. And I think it's just important to remember, although that experience does feel really lonely and it can feel really empty, that you don't have to do it alone, and there can be community in that. And so this is just my experience among the many, many more experiences that people are having. And so just know that you are seen and heard, and religious trauma is real, and that it is an experience that you can get the support that you need for. And so just to be open to finding that community and being curious about how you want to engage with it and how that will be meaningful for you.
Thank you so much for that message. And one last thing that came up for me that I want to say, and I think Emily really embodies that, reconstruction and healing post high control religion is very possible. And I just want to end with that and really invite listeners to tune into that, and by someone who is so young and capable and shows us that you can reconstruct and create such a meaningful life. So thank you so much for tuning in. Until next time. Thank you so much for tuning in today. If today's content resonated with you, please share, leave a review, all the things. It would mean so much to me.